Is my screen visible?
Yes, madam.
Yes, ma'am, your screen is visible. Yeah. So, good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Vishal Varia, convener of LTI Rajkot Central Chapter. And today we have a session on how does a poem mean or how to analyze a poem. We have with us Ma'am Subarna Bhattacharya, ma'am, to take as a session expert. And I would request Neha Shah to please moderate the session and introduce ma'am with the audience. Over to you, Neha, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. Is my voice audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. First of all, a very good evening, a happy evening to everyone, and thank you so much, sir, for giving this chance to me to, give the introduction of ma'am. First of all, I'd like to share a few lines, and then we'll like to go towards the things. We'll like to take the session ahead, and the lines are: the fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. It's truly said that the poetry is one of the excellent ways to express ourselves, emotions, and thoughts. And kids learn another side of language when they learn poetry. But being an English teacher, I have found that most of the kids they quite struggle a lot while understanding or writing any poetry. So here is our session, that is how to analyze a poetry. Like as we all are in the teaching field or connected with it some or the other way, right? So it will be a great help to us first to understand how to analyze a poem, and then how to make it understand to our kids. So we have Subarna ma'am here with us, and I don't know what to say because when I just saw like her qualification and whatever she has done, first of all, thank you so much, ma'am. It's a great opportunity as well as a great pleasure to have you here with us. Ma'am is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English in Symbiosis College of Arts and Commerce in Pune. She has been working as a trainer, like she has already worked as a language trainer, as a soft skill trainer for teachers, for coordinators for few months. Even she has a very huge experience in designing and developing the curriculum, the different kind of course content and all. Even she has she has got her so many papers published in many of the books. Even her research papers are published so at so many places. She has the PhD in English from University of Calcutta. Her she has written so many chapters in many of the books. So ma'am is having like she's a kind of ocean, and today we are going to have so many things, and today we are going to learn so many things from her. So we are really happy as well as we are really fortunate to have you ma'am here with us. So I would not take much of the time and would like to hand over to ma'am. So ma'am, can we go ahead with the session?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much, Neha, for that very kind, elaborate introduction. I'm not sure how to deal with your expectations here because I'm not quite sure about the audience in the sense of I mean whether the presentation will actually be of any help to you. I hope it is. I'll try my best. And yes, literature is my passion and my love. And I started teaching long back in 2003 actually, and since then reading, engaging with literature, especially English literature, has been my way that I have lived life I consider myself still a student and very much a learner, because one doesn't stop learning at any point in time. That I think all of us will agree here. And I feel happy that I will be talking about poetry, because poetry is something I think um, all of us take refuge in, take shelter in, are when we probably suffer from anxiety, or anywhere life we feel that we are betrayed anyway, saddened, betrayed. So for those anxious moments, I think poetry is where we take refuge in. So once again, thank you so much for the organizers, and let me begin here. First of all, a few things before I start talking. That is that since the time is limited, I will try and talk about uh, only particular aspects which are mostly we encounter in our reading of poetry. Otherwise, the this field is huge, so not that everything can be talked about right away, but I'm sure it will give some pointers to further reading and further engagement with this. So I I I think there are two ways we can look at a poem, a text. One is the looking at the text as a separate body, uh, and one is probably looking at a text, looking at a poem, and trying to put it against the backdrop of its context. So that is how I think we can begin the journey across this landscape of reading poetry. That is, either we do a close reading of the text or the close reading of the context. Now the thing is that it's not that one cannot do both these things together. There can be a textual reading as well as a contextual reading. And I think those of us who are engaged in teaching, those of us who we deal with poem texts in classrooms, we try to make it simple and lucid to the students. So therefore, it's not that we do not consider the context, or we do not consider close reading of, we cannot, it cannot be either or, but we do them together. So the first slide here that I'm presenting is mostly about the theoretical approaches. So the traditional approaches that have been engaged in reading of poetry, either to read a poem text as a historical biographical writing, that is to say, to read it against the particular context that the poem originates from, the historical context. So here, if we are reading the poem text in this way, one of these traditional approaches, probably we would consider the socio-political context of the poem, or say the socio-economic or socio-cultural context. Also add to it the poet's biographical details, and is it adding some meaning, special meaning to the text? Is it that it's the poem's origin is from a particular uh, thing in the poet's life? Is it from any of her or his personal experiences that the poem originates from? Then, of course, there are the moral, philosophical, aesthetic aspects of the poem. So these have been more or less the traditional approaches. Once again, I'm saying more or less because I'm not going into the details of the traditional aesthetic criticism that we have. And if we look at it in a very cursory way, on one hand, if there are these traditional approaches, there are these formalist approaches as well. By formalist, I mean to say looking at the form of the text. That is the close reading of the text, where the reader is closely engaging with the images, the symbols, the rhetorical figures, the use of the figures of speech, and dissecting the poem to arrive at the meaning and probably the intended meaning, what the poet intended. So, both these approaches are taking us to the same point actually, that is to understand the meaning of the poem and what probably was the poet's intention in writing. So the traditional approaches were more to read the poem through more its context laying, whereas with the rise of new criticism and the formalist approaches, which were more in the 20th century, developments in theory and criticism, the close reading of the texts became more popular. So once again, I am coming back to the point that it's not that the two approaches do not overlap. They do overlap, and in our regular engagement with poetry, they intersect, they come together, and we finally probably engage with poetry through all of these. So, moving ahead, uh, I am not going to spend time on this at all because each of these are themselves a discourse, a field of discourse. Therefore, there is no way that we can engage with these here right now, but just to raise the point that 20th century gave us the 20th century Western criticism gave us these approaches to study literature and, of course, poetry. So, psychological criticism, the Freudian methods, the feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, structuralist, post structuralist criticism. And these are just the main important ones, or rather the more common ones. One cannot say probably important, but rather the more used common ones, not to talk about phenomenological criticism or new historicism and the reader response theory and so on and so forth. So uh, so as I just said, that we will skip these for now because they are themselves heavy theoretical discourses, theoretical fields of discourses, which need uh, engagement for a longer time. So coming to the primarily how we deal with poetry. So if we have to put it in a very schematic manner, mm, so poems can be narrative. This is easy and simple in the sense simple to understand. They can be narrative, um, narrating any incident or any happening in a historical, chronological way. So, for instance, an epic an epical poem or a ballad which is written on any, maybe a battle fought in history long ago. So it can be narrative, um, it can be lyrical, uh, reflective, meditative. Once again, I talk about this with a kind of a warning that when I am saying that it's narrative poetry, lyrical poetry, reflective, meditative poetry, it's not, I do not mean here that a poem which is lyrical cannot be reflective or meditative. So they can definitely, most certainly, be lyrical as well as meditative. Almost all of Wordsworthian poetry, or even if we look at Indian writing in English, there are so many poems which are lyrical as well as reflective, meditative. Once again, it's not necessary that a narrative poem will not be meditative in some parts of the poem. So a narrative poem is a long poem, and definitely there can be parts of the poem which are very, very reflective, meditative, and as well as lyrical. So, uh, so if we look at the history of English literature, both Indian and Anglo-American, we commonly come across uh, these forms of poetry like epic, ballad, eclogue. Eclogue was a very, very popular uh, very, very popular form of pastoral poetry written by, say, classical poets like the Roman poet, for instance, Virgil, writes eclogues. And they are pastoral poetry talking about the countryside life, the life of the shepherds, the anxieties, their love, their disappointments, frustrations, life. So, eclogue at one point during the classical times, especially in the Greek and Roman tradition of writing, we find eclogues as a very popular form of poetry. Uh, Same one would have to say about odes also. So, once again, from the time of the classical antiquities, from the time of the Horatian odes, ode has remained a popular form till the Romantics, the British Romantics revived the form. And needless to say, we have the the marvelous odes from poets like John Keats. All of us in our from our school life almost are familiar with Ode to a Nightingale and Ode to a Autumn, Ode to Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode on to Autumn, and Ode to Melancholy, Ode to Psyche. Sonnet has been once again a form which the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, the time of the European Renaissance, popularized sonnets, and the sonnets were initially modeled upon the classical sonnets. The Petrarchan sonnets have been an influence on the British Elizabethan sonneteers. And sonnet was a form which one sees not just followed by the Elizabethan uh, poets, um, but also afterwards Shakespeare, I think, with his 154 sonnets, immortalized the form. Sonnet continues to be popular, certainly even after the Elizabethan age, but um, in terms of the British tradition of sonnet writing, I think the Elizabethan sonnets were, one can say, the golden era of sonnets. So similarly, satire, elegy, pastoral elegy, they have been classical forms, afterwards modeled and remodeled upon by the neoclassical poets of Britain, and uh, often there have one sees differences between a classical elegy and say a neoclassical elegy. Same with pastoral elegies as well. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the form never goes out of practice. Dramatic monologues, soliloquies have been very, very popular in the Victorian times. I'm sure we remember Robert Browning immediately as we talk about dramatic monologues. Um, Browning's My Last Duchess or the Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister. These have been often chosen as popular texts to be taught to students. Therefore, I think if we are talking about engaging with poetry as a classroom experience, so giving a pointer to our students as to which form it is and to talk about the form from where it begins its journey. Is it a classical form? Was it revived at a later point? Has there been developments? Are there continuities, or do they show us points of departure? Is the new form different from the classical form? So this is one of the things I think which always help me to ground my students, to uh, bring them there in the first place to read the poem text and understand its form and understand the lyricism, the meditative quality, or is it a narrative, more a narrative poem than a reflective, meditative one. Haikus and prose poems are more recent developments in the writing of poems, and modern. I mean, if we are talking about modern poetry, now probably haikus and prose poems are mostly the form that we find us engaging with. So before I move on, therefore, I think in a classroom discussion, beginning with the form that the poem is in, and what is the primary mode of the writing, that I think can be a good point to begin explaining a poem or reading a poem for our own benefits. Uh, I have here a few rhetorical figures which one needs to, I think, talk about when we are engaging with poetry. The very, very common ones I have chosen here. I'm not probably we do not need to talk about each of these, but the point that once again I'm trying to make here is uh, because we are not just reading a poem, but we are trying to critically read a poem, critically analyze the poem. Therefore, a close look at the rhetorical figures of speech, like the metaphor, or how is the metaphor working in a particular poem, And is it that the use of personification is particularly adding a dimension to the poem? Um, why is it that if it is an ode would almost always begin with an apostrophe. So, therefore, what is an apostrophe, and why is it that an ode always would begin with an apostrophe? That I think gives us a good entry point into understanding the form of ode, that it is a tribute, and therefore apostrophe is what is the likely beginning of an ode. So, once again, why is it that Elizabethan sonnets, the British Elizabethan sonnets, had so many hyperboles in their texts? Why is it that in Shakespearean sonnets we again and again come across hyperboles? What are they, and are they serving any particular purpose in our reading? So, these also, I think, are good pointers to further our discussions. Um, I have a few poems which I thought I will be talking about the texts. So the plan is to have the PPTs, the slides through which we get the pointers, and then we will look at the texts, actually the texts, and we'll try to see that how they can be managed better in a classroom environment where we have young learners who are trying to know how to critically read. I would want to ask before I further proceed, how much time do I have?
Ma'am, you have around half an hour with you.
Uh,
I would appreciate some interaction from the audience so
yes,
that
yes, yeah,
ma'am.
right. Yes, absolutely. So I would also want that. So I have a few poems here which have been my favorites, and
Madam, would it be possible to please address the question one in between so that we can then move to the sample poems?
question one in the sense. Sorry.
It is written in the chat box. I'll just read
Oh,
out the question.
okay.
Okay. Please cover the difference between form and structure of a poem.
Okay, all right. I think what I mean, what is usually meant by form is uh, are these which I have been talking about, like ode, sonnet. These are forms. Uh, one can possibly say a particular mode of writing. It's a form which has historically evolved, and by structure, what we mean is more the stanza pattern, the metrical styles, the stanzaic forms. So they are what we mean by structure. For instance, let us say, if we say that this is a Spenserian stanza with a particular metrical style, that is to look at the poem as a structure, and the form is that it's the sonnet. So
Okay, so the physical building is the structure. The physical building, the architecture of a poem is a structure. Supposingly, if you look at the emblem poetry, so it has a structure on its own. Say, for example, if I'm writing a poem on a candle and I put my word in the order which they can appear as the flame of a candle, so that could be the structure of a poem.
I think so.
Yes,
Think so.
thank you.
Okay, so I'll just move on right now to the to one more important thing, I think, which my screen is visible, right?
Yes, yes, it
Okay.
is.
So yes, so this is something I think which often helps us in looking at or understanding a poem. That is to look at the images that the writer, the poet, is using. So when I'm saying imagery, I'm talking about images taken collectively. So every writing is every writing almost uses an image, right? What is an image? So an image is when an object is being described through words in the poem text, or it is any other sense perception. So not necessarily an image has to be a visual image. Probably visual image is the most popular, but um, not necessarily all images are visual, right? So there can be auditory images, there can be tactile images, there can be thermal, olfactory, gustatory, kinesthetic images, where a poem is talking about movement, any kind of sensation of movement, like let us say the spring breeze. So a spring breeze is probably a tactile image, as well as a kinesthetic image. So a storm. So there is once again, it's not necessary that an image will be either olfactory or tactile or visual, but we know that, um, especially in modern poetry, we often come across engagement of more than one sensory experience in a poem. So therefore the imagery is complex there. What we call is a synesthesia, which is putting several more than one sensory experience together in building an image. So word pictures, images are often referred to. Um, uh, Towards the 20th century, more and more as we have moved, when I'm saying 20th century and moving towards 20th century, I have in mind the Anglo-American tradition of uh, English poetry. So with the French symbolists, like let us say Baudelaire or Laforgue, or the other symbolists like say Rilke, mm, afterwards, we see that images no longer remain just images. That is, they do not just signify that particular object or that particular experience that the poet is referring to, but it is deriving meaning by signifying something else beyond that particular object or set of experience or event. That is an image becoming a symbol. So it does not, I mean, a rose need not necessarily just mean the flower, but it may mean something else, which is beyond the physical object of the flower, but it has some other significance, some deeper significance. So that is the use of an image in the creation of a symbol. That is to say, use of symbolism in poetry. When it is referring to some experiences or something beyond the physicality of the object, but it has a range of reference beyond itself. So um, it's not that symbolism has started with the French symbolists or the decadent poets like Baudelaire, Lafort. Not that symbolism has been there even earlier, but one sees that one has to, I think, agree that 20th century has given us more and more complex symbolist poetry, more intellectual, more cerebral, and therefore more symbolic. And images have been engaged in the meaning making process of the poetry in a much more complex way than they have been earlier. So um, I these are the pointers which I thought are the primary basic ones with which we can now engage with the texts which are of my choice. Anything that anybody has in mind until now?
Yes,
Uh,
madam, I have a question.
yes.
When does an image become a symbol?
That is, I think, what I was trying to talk about. That when a poem is uh, does not restrict the use of an image to just refer to that object, it becomes a symbol, right? In the sense, in a poem, um, uh, for instance, let us take examples. So, in a Wordsworth poem, let us say Wordsworth uses flowers like violet. Uh, just a reference to the flower violet, he says. Or let us say, take a more common example of a Wordsworthian poem, the daffodils. It means it's referring to the daffodils and it's an image. He is talking about the host of golden daffodils which are swaying their heads in a breeze. But he is not meaning anything beyond the flower daffodils. Now we move to William Blake, a contemporary of William Wordsworth. And Blake has a poem called The Sick Rose. So, in that poem, The Sick Rose, the rose isn't important, not important at all, because what he is talking about in the poem The Sick Rose is actually the moral degeneration of uh, uh, human being, of people, of the society. So he is using the image of the rose which is being eaten over by the worm. The worm is eating the rose, and therefore he says, Rose, thou art sick,
Hmm.
because you have been eaten over by the worm. But actually, the rose or the worm is not what is the poet's intention here, but he is moving beyond that to actually mean the moral degeneration of the society.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
then the sick rose becomes a symbol there. It no more remains just an image,
Hmm.
right?
So the extensive treatment will make all the difference to an image into
Yes, yes.
making it a symbol.
Yes, yes. So when the image gathers that much significance that we ought to look beyond that
Yes.
physical
Yes.
object, it
Excellent.
becomes a symbol. So that symbol is created in the mind of the reader, actually. The
Okay.
poem
Okay.
text does not have the symbol in it.
That's lovely, madam. That's
The
lovely.
symbol is created in our head when we read it and we connect it with the bigger reality.
Yes, the broader version of it.
Yes, when we connect it to the broader, bigger version of reality, that image moves
Yes.
on to becomes a symbol. Anything
Yeah.
else?
So we have a
Um,
question, madam, from Nepal.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Uh,
Please go ahead. Mr. Ram, please go ahead.
Sir, before that, we have a question in the chat box from Mr. Deepak Kumar.
Yes.
The question in the chat box says, what you think about Indian English poems during pre-independence India?
um,
What do you think about Indian English poems
I
during
am.
pre-independence India? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about I mean, how to answer this. So I don't think Indian writing in English ever had any dearth of talent as when it comes to writing poems, because
Hmm.
we have a plethora of poems, let us say, coming from Rabindranath Tagore,
Tagore, yes.
uh, coming from even women poets like, let
Sarojini
us say,
Naidu. Hmm.
Sarojini Naidu, Toru Dutt. And one thing, one particularly, I think um, that strikes us when we read the Indian poetry of the pre-independence colonial period is, on the one hand, there is one can see that uh, there is an urge in the poets to refer to the Western traditions. The Western canon of poetry has been an influence, whether it is Madhusudan Datta's poems or Rabindranath Tagore or Toru Dutt. But yes, the Western influence has been there, but uh, equally important is to see that how they are also trying to have a uniqueness of their own. So that is an interesting thing, because poetry became one of the important forms when it comes to nationalist literature of the time, and therefore uh, therefore uh, yes, there was a pressing need that India represents itself on the world forum through its poetry, and Tagore being the primary face there. Tagore himself has been hugely influenced by British poets, I mean, the Irish British poet like W.B. Yeats. Yeats has been a close friend of Tagore, but definitely Tagore poems are much more and different as well than Yeats. There has been an influence. One sees that influence. On the other hand, there is difference as well, which makes it very, very Indian. I have in my selection Toru that's our casual in a tree. If you are interested, we can look at the poem together.
Yes, madam, please.
Is it that we wait for the questions after we look at the poems?
Yeah. Ma'am, there are a few more questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there is one, rather, I would say, an opinion that we would like to see or hear ma'am analyzing a poem.
Uh, Sorry, once again, please.
Where we would like to see or listen to ma'am
Uh-huh.
analyzing a poem.
Okay. So
Can
I.
you, if you have an example,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
There was a
and then
question
there's
about Bob Dylan somewhere I saw.
Yes, someone mentioned Bob Dylan as well.
Yeah.
Is there any different in teaching songs, for example, songs of Bob Dylan? Trivedi
And
Mega has asked a question.
yeah.
You,
I'm
you can
very
please open your
sure.
video and go ahead, Miss Trivedi.
yeah, we still have another questions before that. Um, how there is a question from Mr. Ganesh. How can I help my students teach poetry in critical way if the students don't understand the content initially?
Um, I think what has helped me always is to begin by giving a context. The author, uh, the poet, the placing the poet in the historical context, in the sense, what is the timeline that we are looking at? Are we looking at the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century? Is it a contemporary poem? So as soon as the time is given to the student, I think there is a mind map which is easy to create then. And a little bit of the poet's life and any particular, let us say, movement that the poet is associated with, that those are things which help the students, I think, to start imagining and getting rooted in that particular time and position. And otherwise the text becomes very, very remote for the for the student. It's not that the student is easily connecting with it. I think that's the problem. So biographical details, slightly historical details help in that mind map, and then we with creating that interest, which can be through images. I mean, now we use Google all the time for teaching. So I often use images or small videos which help in the historical context building. And then if we look at the poem, probably that uh, helps in bringing the text closer to the learner. That has been my experience. I don't know.
Yeah. So, ma'am, do we have an example to be shared with the audience where you would be analyzing a poem and
Yes, yes,
demonstrating how to analyze it?
yes, yes. Uh, just a minute. I'm trying to share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's in the process. Yeah, it is visible now.
Okay. Um, I don't know, but I mean, I was not sure which poems would make sense here, what kind of poems currently you all are teaching and what I am teaching. So I have tried to choose a range of poems. One Shakespearean sonnet, very common one. And I have here a Lucy poem by William Wordsworth. I have in modern poetry one of Sylvia Plath's poem, which I am in love with, and I have Toru Dutt's Are Casual in a Tree, an Imagist poem, which is a haiku by Ezra Pound, and Maya Angelou's Still I Rise. So the point that we were discussing, I think, is how to make a poem interesting in class for our students. So I think I'll go from down up. So this um, poem, Still I Rise, Maya Angelou's, an American black American writer, feminist poet as well. So she is talking about the oppressions which racism has inflicted on the blacks in America. And I think a good way to teach, say, a poem like this, like Maya Angelou's "Still I Rise." "Still I Rise" is uh,
Madam, we have lost your screen. If you can upload the image once again.
oh, okay, yeah, sure.
See, this generally happens, when by mistake anyone else would present a screen, then the earlier screen presentation would go in the background, and the recently presented screen would come in the foreground. So once ma'am presents her screen now, I would request ma'am to pin that screen so that screen remains in the focus.
Is it visible
Is
now?
it? Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Yeah. So I was talking about Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. So what I was trying to uh, point out here is, if we are handling a poem as socio-political as, say, Still I Rise, it's a powerful poem which is a rebellious poem talking about the generations of oppressions which has happened on the American black people, the African American. And she says that, do you think that I will forever remain broken and terrified? But you try to shoot me down with your words, you may cut me down with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I will rise. So a rebellious poem like this, for instance, if we are handling this in class, I think the poem will not make sense unless we contextualize it. And therefore, what I began the presentation with, texts and contexts, that becomes valid here. That without knowing the history of Black America, the context of racism, the even after abolition of slavery, that racial segregation continued in America very much so. So I usually pull down images from the Google where I can talk about how racial segregation remained a reality, and how there were black schools and white schools. Like the doctor's clinic, a black person would not be allowed to go to a white dentist for a dental checkup. So these help the students to connect with the particular context of the poem. Then, if I'm talking about Maya Angelou's personal experiences, how she suffered as a black woman, how was it difficult for her to rise uh, out of the sham that was there. So then it makes sense, and I think it becomes easy for the learner to engage with it. So a poem like this, definitely, I think it's a long poem, therefore I'm not looking at or reading the whole of it, but just pointing out, it would not make sense unless one explains through context what we mean by, what Maya Angelou means by hearts of history's shame. So, what is this history that she is referring to? So, in poems like this, I think beginning with the context is what is more important than probably dissecting figures of speech like, say, I am a black ocean. So she is using a metaphor here, but unless the poem's context is clear, just engaging with the rhetorical part of it probably will not appeal so much to the learner. She uses so many metaphors, nights of terror and fear. But they come secondary, the context comes first. So, uh, however, if we are, let us say, looking at a poem like She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways, Wordsworth. So, the poem, that there is no very clear evidence as to how the poem originates. This is one of the Lucy poems by Wordsworth. Now there is no biographical clarity as to who Lucy was. Was Lucy at all anybody? uh, did William Wordsworth know her? Why she wrote the Lucy poems? So, because the context isn't very known to us, Probably a better way to engage with such a poem as this is to look at the images more than spending time on the context. So, this is a smooth, easy reading. She dwelt among the untrodden ways beside the springs of Tao, a maid whom there were none to praise and very few to love. A violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky. She lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be, but she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. So, I think a poem like this, we need to spend more time with the images here. A violet by a mossy stone, so half hidden from the eye. So it's the rural imagery which comes through a poem like this. So engaging with it in a more imagistic manner, I think helps in constructing the rural British countryside. To talk about it more specifically, the Lake District, the famous Lake District that Wordsworth brings back again and again to his poetry. So maybe a few pictures from the internet of the Lake District, the beautiful countryside, and then trying to build the images as mental constructs, that helps. So, similarly, if we, let us say, talk about uh, a poem like this. So, this is just a two-line poem, and there is no other way to read the poem but to look very, very closely at the images, and that the image does not remain just an image but becomes a symbol here. So Pound is talking about the station of the metro. So the first thing that strikes us here is the 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 poem is a very urban poem. It's not talking about nature or countryside, flowers, the meadow, the hills, the greenery, but it's talking about the metro station, and what in the metro station? People. People probably coming back from the office or going to the office, and crowd, not just one or two, but thousands. And what is the word that he uses here? Apparition. So they look like an apparition. They don't look so human, but look like probably zombies walking in the metro station. And he says petals on a wet black bough. So it looks like they are petals on the black branches of a tree. So definitely the word black becomes important here. Is it that the branch of the tree has blackened because of the the excessive hyper urbanity, the pollution, or is it that he's talking about moral degeneration, corruption? So could be anything, and that brings us to the most important poem. Most important thing about reading poetry is more and more we see that modern poetry remains open ended and subject to interpretation. So they are very interpretative, complex poems, and therefore very, very impressionistic. That is, they create particular impression, and the impression on your mind and the impression on my mind will be different. So the subjectivity is important here. We cannot say that this is exactly what the meaning of the poem is, but the meaning itself is uh, complex and therefore unstable. There is no fixity anywhere. He can mean, he could have meant many, many things. So that is the interesting part of the poems which are now being written. That now that symbolism is what modern poetry almost rests on, one can say, and therefore it's interesting. Uh,
Ma'am, there is one more question in chat. Is by Mr. Ram Sabak Thakur. He said, kindly shed light on animation, pathetic fallacy, personification, anthropomorphism, and such other related terms.
uh, yeah, of course. So, all of these that you are talking about here are different rhetorical strategies, different rhetorical figures which are used, like uh, intentional fallacy, affective fallacy, personification. Personification, I think, is the easiest to understand.
Yes.
Once again, pull this up. So, maybe we look at it through the text, that becomes more effective, I think. So for instance, I'm sure all of us have at some point read Toru Dutt's Our Casuar in a Tree. It's a, for that matter, not a very complex poem, a simple poem where Toru Dutt is talking about a particular casuar in a tree, which has been there in her childhood, in her own house, and she has spent her childhood along with her siblings under the tree. As soon as she opens the windows, she could see the tree, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing is that this casual in a tree is just not a tree here, because it has remained as a memory in her mind, and therefore to um, make it significant to in the reader's mind, that she is not just talking about the tree, but the tree is much more than the tree right now. The tree is not just that particular tree, but through that particular tree she is talking about nature. That nature, she says, is probably something which is more long lasting than human life is. Whereas human life is transient and short, nature seems to uh, be a perpetual existence. So, how does she do that here? So, she's here, for instance, she is saying, thy form, O tree, as in my happy prime, I saw thee in my own loved native clime. So, by using this particular apostrophe, O tree, and by talking about the tree as not just a tree, but a form, an impression, which has remained from there in her mind from her childhood, from the happy prime, the childhood. She says that uh, I see you from the time of my childhood, from the lovely native uh, clime. By native clime, once again, she's talking about the familiarity of the environment that she has grown up in, and the tree helped in making it easy and beautiful for her. So, thus, the figures of speech become important, almost strategic, one can say, for a poet. Once again, here, for instance, In the next paragraph, she says, "Therefore, I fain would consecrate a lay unto thy honor, tree with a capital." So the tree is just not any tree, but a particular embodiment here. "Beloved of those who now in blessed sleep for our repose, dearer than life to me, alas, were they. Mayst thou be numbered when my days are done with deathless trees like those in Borodel, under whose awful branches lingered pale fear, trembling hope, death, the skeleton, and time, the shadow." Now, when she says time, the shadow, she is personifying time here. She is talking about hope and personifying hope as trembling, as if a man or is shaking, right, in fear. So what she is trying to, what use is this of here? That uh, immediately there is an image construction in the head of the reader, that she is talking about time, not just in an abstract way, but as if time is a shadow. Now, casting a shadow, the past casting a shadow on the present. So these become more real if they come in the poem as personifications, I think. The same one can talk about in this uh, Shakespeare's sonnet as well. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shakespeare's sonnets use personification in so many wonderful ways. So personification as well as the metaphors. So, for instance, he is using a metaphor here. "Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines." He's certainly talking about the blazing sun of the summer, but without using the word sun, he says, "Too hot the eye of heaven shines." So, not only they are aesthetic, but uh, also I think bring complexities to it, in the sense uh, the employment of natural imagery helps building of the central idea of the poem.
Yeah, I beg your attention, ma'am, and the audience. We are over 10 minutes as per the schedule.
Yeah.
And yeah, so if anyone wishes to have any questions asked, I mean, if everybody is comfortable with continuing with the session, we continue. As such, we are missing some of the members, as I think the time has a little sensitive thing. I have a hand raised by Agar Hari Ji. Can you quickly ask the question, please? You wish to? Arindam Ghosh, you want to ask any question? Please unmute yourself and ask. Are the questions, are the hand raises meant to ask particular questions is done by mistake? I think it's not the question. So anyway, ma'am, we'll consider the sensitivity of the time, and I would request Rashmi Gotecha, Professor Rashmi Gotecha, to please unmute herself and yeah, please go ahead with the vote of thanks for the session.
Thank you, sir. It was a really wonderful session. Respected Meenu Jasdanwala, President, Dr. Vishal Varia, sir, Conveyor, and all the members of LTI Rajkot Central Chapter, Subarna Chatterjee, ma'am, our most valued session expert. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, Rashmi Gotecha, on behalf of LTI Rajkot Central Chapter and on my own behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our session expert Subarna Chatterjee ma'am for gracing with your presence and sharing with us your expertise today.
Sorry
A
to
big thank you, ma'am,
interrupt
the
you,
way
Rashmi
type of
madam. I
poetry
am
and
Subarna
their own and
Bhattacharya.
explain in a very distinctively way that we are not just reading the poem, like the way you analyze the poem, Still I Rise. We are we are all enlightened by your words, ma'am. Now, I would like to thank our moderator for the day, Miss Neha Sa, and our lovely audience. Well, ladies and gentlemen, an event like this cannot happen overnight. The wheels start rolling weeks ago. It requires planning and a bird eye for details. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by a core team: Visal sir, Meenu sir, Brij sir, Ketan sir, Dharmesh sir, Shrikant sir, Chetan sir, and Tayyab sir. Like very motivated and dedicated team of LTI Rajkot Central Chapter who know their job and result oriented. I mean, they are really result oriented people. Now, finally, at the last, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rashmi. I beg your attention towards silly error here, and I apologize, Subarna ma'am, for the same. It's Subarna Bhattacharya and not Subarna Chatterjee. Ma'am, please pardon her for this silly mistake. And I really thank you, ma'am, for taking this wonderful session here today. And yeah, well, lovely audience, I've just shared with you the link of the feedback form. I would wish everyone to please kindly submit a feedback so that we can come to know where we need to improve. And yes, you will be getting your attendance certificate based on the email that you are filling up in the form. So here we are concluding today's session.
So there is a technical error which is posted by someone. If you could please address that error.
Sorry, feedback
There
is
is
not working. Feedback. Okay, let me just check it out. Feedback is working. I already had tested it.
okay. And Subarna madam, from our chapter's end, we will send you your e-certificate for the wonderful session that you have delivered to all of us today.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thank you.
Ma'am, Subarna ma'am, we are no one to certify you. It is just a token of appreciation that we'll be sending across you or the email. And Meenu sir, the feedback form is working very well. I would request Mr. Ganesh to please try it once again. Thank you, one and all, lovely audience, and we'll come back with another such brilliant topic with an expert of the topic to share their expertise with us. Thank you, one and all, for sharing your lovely time with us. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, madam. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Invalid dynamic link.